Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It depends on where you are in the world. This is Frederick Winsness with the NetHope Solutions Center, and I want to invite everybody to yet another NetHope Solutions Center webinar in our series. This time we're kicking off a new series on renewable energies, and today we're going to be talking about solar solutions for humanitarian operations. And we have representatives from Cuba, from Moving Energy Initiative, Energy for Impact, and NetHope today. And I will be introducing the speakers in a few minutes. Before we get started, just want to go over our normal housekeeping rules. We want to make this as interactive as possible. So please open the chat window. You do that at the bottom of your screen. It's the third icon from the right. And follow along with the conversation there. You can post your questions in the chat window, and we will hold those questions and do a Q&A session towards the end of the hour. We are also recording the session today, so please look for a follow-up mail with the recording and the slides, or the pointers to the recording on the slides that will be posted on the NetHope Solutions Center. And you should feel free to share that with colleagues and others that do not have a chance to join us live here today. We will also, towards the end of the hour, we'll do a couple of polls. We will ask a few questions before we end the session today on your interest and additional topics to be covered, as well as an overall webinar satisfaction poll. So if you wouldn't mind, take a few minutes to answer that, that would be very, very helpful so we can improve this series going forward. Well, without any delays, I will turn things over to Frank Scott. He is the Managing Director of New Program Development at NetHope. And together with Duncan Drury, he is leading the efforts around the Alternative Energy Working Group. So, Frank, over to you.
Well, thanks, Frederick. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. NetHope began working on the renewable energy program earlier this year, and leading that work is Duncan Drury, formerly with Christian Aid, now with NetHope, and Mark Hawkins, who's with Save the Children. And they're really the guys who have been doing the heavy lifting around the development of this program. Let's go to the next slide. And the next one. So the program has 5 work streams currently, and really this is meant to address a shared problem that NetHope member NGOs and others in the international development sector are experiencing. All of our member NGOs are working in areas where access to clean energy solutions is sometimes limited because there's no grid, or the grid is not reliable. And so the easy solution is to turn to diesel generators, and of course those do the job, but they're polluting and expensive. And increasingly over the last few years, our members and others are looking at transitioning to clean energy solutions such as solar energy. So what we want to do with the renewable energy program at NetHope is work in 5 areas. The first is technical assistance, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. The second 2 are to do demonstration pilots. The first type of demonstration pilot is in a single tenant location where it's just a standalone NGO location that needs solar solutions or some kind of clean energy solutions. The second type of demonstration pilot is one where a solution such as a mini grid could be set up to support multiple clients, and those clients might be NGOs clustered together with field programs, with perhaps a community nearby. So that'll be the second set of demonstration pilots. The fourth work stream is around business model and financing, and we know that transition to solar is challenging for many because of the large upfront costs. And so what we want to do is help with the business modeling, but then also the financing of solutions. And finally, there's a lot of innovation happening in this space. And as new products, new approaches come to us and come to our members, we hope to evaluate those with our member NGOs and share the learning about the new technologies that are out there. But on the technical assistance front, one of the first things we've done, and Mark Hawkins at Save the Children deserves a lot of credit for this, is to do an NGO guide for energy solutions. And if you go to the chat window, there's a link there where you can find that living document out on the NetHope Solutions Center. And that's something that will be evolving over time, but Mark and others got us off to a good start with that. Another piece of technical assistance that we want to do is in the form of webinars, and today's webinar is under that umbrella. And so what I want to do is introduce today's session, but then also as you're listening to today's session, be thinking about the types of technical assistance webinars that we could be doing in the future. And at the end of this webinar, there will be a short one-question survey around other topics that you'd like to see us cover. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Laura and Mads to cover this session today. Laura?
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Frank, for the introduction, and welcome to everyone that's listening in. My name's Laura Patel. I work for Energy for Impact, and today I'm representing the Moving Energy Initiative, and I'll be co-presenting with Mads Hansen from Cube Energy, and we're going to be talking about solar solutions for humanitarian operations. Next slide. So just to briefly take you through the agenda for our presentation today, we're going to start and give some introduction to our respective organizations, and then we're going to move on and talk about the potential benefits for humanitarian organizations to transition to solar. We're going to look at some of the different options that are available to do this before talking about the pros and cons, the economic analysis for these options. We're going to touch a bit on the challenges involved and potential solutions, and also discuss some good practice and experience from the field before we finalize with a call to action for all of you. Okay, next slide. And the next one. Okay, so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is based on research that we've done under the Moving Energy Initiative. So the Moving Energy Initiative is a research-focused program that's trying to improve the way that energy is managed and accessed within displacement settings. So that's for displaced people, but also for the organizations, the governments, and the communities that work alongside them. So the program is being implemented by a consortium of 5 organizations. So Energy for Impact, who I work for, we lead this along with Chatham House and Practical Action, with support from UNHCR, NRC, and funding from DFID. And the program has been implemented in 2 phases. So the second phase has just come to an end in 2019. And the second phase is focused both on research, but also on trying to demonstrate new approaches on the ground. So we've been implementing projects in Kenya, Jordan, and Burkina Faso. And a lot of the work we've done has had a focus on, firstly, improving the evidence base to increase the case for change for humanitarian energy. It's been testing new approaches that can act as demonstrators for others, and it's also had a strong focus on engaging the private sector. Okay, next slide. So it's been a very broad program looking at both the energy use of displaced people, the policy side research. But what we're going to talk about today and what I'm going to focus on is the research that we've done that relates to the energy use of humanitarian organizations. And there's been 3 key areas we've looked at. First, with our partner Chatham House, we conducted research into the fuel use of humanitarian agencies. which was summarized in a report that we published in December last year called The Cost of Fueling Humanitarian Aid. Something else we did was research specifically in Kakuma, Kenya, looking at options for infrastructure management contracts. So this is where the private sector could be engaged to provide energy as a service in humanitarian operations. And we have another research paper on that. And then we also worked with Cube Energy to fund the solarization of 2 IRC health clinics in Kakuma, with the aim of really demonstrating these projects on the ground so that others can see the benefits of transitioning to solar. And the picture there is actually an aerial view of one of those installations. Okay, next slide. And I'll hand over to Mads to introduce Cube Energy.
Thank you, Laura, and hi, everyone. So just quickly, Cube Energy is a company that helps international organizations transition from diesel generators to renewable energy. So we were actually a group of people that had worked for the UN and started the company in 2016 to address some of the technical and financial challenges that organizations faced when wanting to benefit from renewable energy. So we started the company with 3 main ambitions. One was to get a more systematic overview over the energy use that humanitarian organizations have. The second was to understand what technical solutions were available to meet these needs. And the third was to work with donors, investors, and other financing mechanisms to see if it was possible to offer renewable energy as a service rather than selling installations or components. Currently, we have operations in South Sudan, Kenya, Somalia, and Mali, and hoping to also open up operations in Central African Republic later this year. Next slide, please. So in this seminar, we really want the participants to remain with sort of an understanding of the benefits that transitioning to solar can bring to their operations. We want them to have a better understanding of the options they have for going solar, both in terms of technical options and in terms of procurement. We want to look at some of the challenges and opportunities in that process, and we want to provide a bit of advice on how organizations can start the journey. Next slide, please. And another one.
Okay, so I'll take over again, and I'm going to start by giving you a bit of background based on some of the research that the Moving Energy Initiative did that looked into the energy use of humanitarian agencies. So we know that energy is essential to humanitarian action, and the majority of refugee camps and settlements for internally displaced people, they tend to be in remote locations where there is not necessarily access to the grid or energy utility companies. So agencies do spend a lot of money on fuel for providing on-site generation as part of the operations. So some of the that we did when we spoke to different humanitarian organizations was that there's no major agency that has a comprehensive strategy for addressing energy use, although we are seeing positive signs of people to look. Humanitarian agencies are paying too much for energy they consume and overwhelmingly on oil fuel to managing their energy in an efficient manner. But at the same time, there's often incentives for them. There's few agencies that actually are motivating in place for tracking it. And that also results in lack of transparency because there's few people that are actually collecting and reporting on energy data. Next slide. This was something that was apparent in the research that MEI did. It was actually very difficult to get data around this, but based on the limited research that we were able to do and data from others in the sector, we estimated that around 5% of humanitarian agencies' expenditure goes on diesel, petrol, and the associated costs of fixing generators. So if we look across the whole sector, that would mean spending 1.2 billion on polluting fuel in 2017. Where we were able to get data from agencies, 7 agencies we surveyed in Kenya, they had spent $6.7 million in 2017. So we can really see the scale of or the amount of money that is being spent on providing power and energy in these contexts. Next slide. So doing things differently could really create large savings for the sector as a whole and individual agencies. MEI estimated that around 60% could be saved on generation costs, and this is using technology and best practice that's already available and has been proven in the field. So if we extrapolate that across the sector, it could mean operational savings of 517 million a year, which is roughly about 5% of UNHCR's funding gap. So this is all research and data, but we can see the potential there, and the potential is not just in financial savings, it's in promoting sustainable energy strategies that can help agencies build positive relationships with host governments and societies, and also providing or increasing the value of legacy assets that could be left behind after humanitarian crisis ends. Next slide. So in terms of what this might mean for an individual humanitarian organization, if they were to transition to solar, there are several benefits. One, it's going to lower the costs and reduce the amount of money that has been spent on diesel fuel. It's going to potentially improve operational efficiency and help organizations deliver more cost-effective services. And these cost savings can potentially be reinvested in other services, such as healthcare, education, or other activities that humanitarian agencies are involved in. There's also potential to improve staff well-being if they're able to work and live in well-lit and comfortable places. There's also potential to look at the expansion of solar assets to provide or improve energy access in local communities as well. And then transitioning to solar energy can present organizations with a real opportunity to minimize their carbon footprint and also help to mitigate climate change, which in itself is one of the causes of population displacement. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly run through some of the options for a humanitarian agency that might want to transition to solar. And I think Mads is going to build on some of these slides later on as well. So solar is also not the only option. You could also look at other renewable technologies such as wind, but solar tends to be the preferred one and the one that is being explored most in these settings. And solar systems, they can be installed in different configurations, and it's very much dependent on the organization's energy needs, their goals, the location, and the specific context for the system. But they generally tend to be a hybrid of solar and diesel. So they'll include solar panels, but also they'll have a diesel generator, and then the accompanying equipment such as inverters, controllers, and batteries. So that during the day you would have your solar panels converting the sun and providing power, and then at night or for backup you'd have your diesel generators. And then you can also have batteries that can store the energy and provide as a backup, but the more batteries you tend to have, then the higher the cost of the system tends to be. Okay, next slide. So just to run through some options, you could look at a pure solar system, and this would be where you would have 100% of the power provided by solar. And you'd also have to have a large battery bank that could store the power during the day to provide that power at night or during an emergency. So this would be if you really wanted to go 100% green, an organization that could make some significant investment in this and would have space available for a larger solar system and battery bank, and probably where fuel is very expensive and difficult to procure. Okay, next slide. Another option could be a solar control system in which your solar system is providing the majority of power, say 60 to 90%, but you still have your diesel generator providing backup and energy during the night, and you'd have a medium-sized battery bank to store power as well. So this is for organizations that want to reduce fuel consumption. Fuel is expensive. They're able to make some investment, and they would have space to have a solar array as well. Okay, next slide. And then moving towards the other end, you can have systems that are still mainly dependent on diesel, with a diesel generator providing the majority of the power and then solar providing the balance. And in such a case, you probably wouldn't need to have batteries. And this is for organizations that want to reduce some fuel consumption but potentially don't have money to invest in a large solar system or don't have space to put it. Okay, next slide. So that kind of some of the technical configurations you could have, but there's also additional considerations that need to be looked into. So you would also be looking at things like the technical expertise within your organization and what support you might need here. You need to consider what's the financing that's available to procure the system and for the long-term O&M operations and maintenance of the system. You probably need to understand what procurement procedures you'll need to comply with and how that might impact on procuring a system. And then another point that's very important is the long-term operations and maintenance. So you need to consider not just the upfront cost and purchase of the system, but how it's going to be operated and maintained in the long run. And I think Mads is going to talk a bit more about this later. Okay, next slide. So there's some of the kind of technical configurations and considerations, but in addition, there's different business models and operational models that humanitarian organizations can consider to transition to solar. And again, it depends on the context and the particular situation of the agency. So for example, an organization might consider purchasing a solar system outright. And sorry, just to mention here that these options are based on the solar guide that we produced with Cube Energy, where we tried to segregate these different operation models into 4 different options. So I'm just going to run through these now. So the first one, purchase. So this is where a humanitarian organization would purchase the system themselves. So they'd likely contract a solar engineering firm, maybe through a procurement process, to design and procure and install the system. And then once it's installed, the ownership would transfer to the humanitarian organization. So they would assume the responsibility for operating and maintaining the system, although they could look at options for outsourcing the operations and maintenance of the system as well. Okay, next slide. And then another option could be lease to own. So this is where a humanitarian organization, they could lease the system from a solar services company for a monthly fee. So it's a bit like a pay-as-you-go model or paying in installments, where the solar service company is financing and would install and operate and maintain the system. But the idea is that eventually the system would be transferred to the organization when the lease ends. And such a lease could run from maybe somewhere from 3 to 10 years. And then once the lease ends, the organization would then be responsible for that system, the operations and maintenance of it. Next slide. So the last two options I'm going to talk about are based on what's called a power purchase agreement. And this is where a humanitarian organization or any organization has an agreement with the private sector under which they're going to purchase a specific amount of power from that private sector provider. So one option that we've talked about is a limited PPA. So this could be where it's only the power that's generated by the solar system that could be covered. So the organization would buy that solar energy from the private sector, and they would pay a monthly fee, either a fixed fee that's been agreed on, or it could be variable, like you pay your electricity bill, depending on what you've used. And then the solar services company could finance the design installation of that system. The organization could then still operate its generators and procure fuel. And then at the end of the agreement, it would be up to the organization whether they would renew that or cancel that, in which case the company would remove the solar asset. And then such agreements typically run somewhere from 3 to 10 years, but it really depends on the company and the investment involved. Next slide. And then the next slide talks about a full PPA, which is very similar, but it could be a case where the private sector or this solar services company could provide a complete package. So they could manage the solar system, the diesel generator, and a humanitarian organization would have an agreement in place where they're buying that energy from the private sector. And again, such an agreement might run for a number of years. Okay, next slide. So as you've seen in the models, there's varying levels of private sector engagement when looking at how humanitarian organizations might transition to solar. And there can be a lot of benefits from working with the private sector because they have the expertise, they're experts in this sector. They've done this kind of thing in lots of different locations. So it can allow you to leverage their expertise, their potential innovation and efficiency. And having these types of agreements in place, the private sector are incentivized to make sure that solar system is performing to maximum efficiency, and they're going to deliver projects on budget. It can also transfer operational risk to the private sector, where they're given the responsibility of operating and maintaining that system. And that's something we've seen in a lot of examples, is that's often when solar systems fail. It's not necessarily in the initial installation, but in the long-term management of them. And it can also enable humanitarian organizations to leverage additional financing that the private sector can provide that might be more flexible or adaptable than what agencies have on offer. And at the same time, there can be some negatives. The private sector will be providing energy as a service or an investment to see a return on that. So they may want to see long-term commitments or guarantees, and they may expect or it may cost more upfront to make sure they see that return on investment. Can also sometimes involve in-depth negotiation around risk sharing and contracts that humanitarian organizations might not be used to. And it might mean that sometimes the in-house workforce gets limited experience on how to manage these assets. Okay, next slide. And I'm going to hand over to Mads, who's going to talk a bit more about the pros and cons of some of the different options.
Thank you, Laura. So I think when we're setting up this slide, what we discussed was that there are mainly 3 dimensions that impact on the pros and cons of the various options. First is what type of capital that the organizations have access to. The second is what time horizon is the organization wanting to include in sort of their cost-benefit analysis, and what how many years can they commit to in a contract. And the third is what level of technical expertise does the organization have, and what ability or do they have to absorb some of the risks connected with installing a solar plant. So as a bit what Laura said earlier on the access to capital, a big con with the purchase of a solar system is that it requires quite a lot of upfront payments to be made, and that that will limit the availability of this option to quite a few organizations, and particularly when we're seeing sort of a whole industry moving towards renewables, as we're seeing now, that will require a significant amount of investment. On the years and sort of if organizations do have a long perspective of how long they will be staying in an area, it's quite clear, and we'll go into the economic analysis in the next couple of slides, but that the purchase and the lease options do have an advantage over the PPA agreements, where they tend to have a sort of a payback of around 4 years to consider, compared to the diesel generator options. Well, the PPA is often a bit longer than that. But a big con with the purchase option is that it is also the option where the organizations absorb the most amount of the technical risks. So it can be a bit of a complicated procurement process where organizations have to choose between different options that they're not guaranteed will work in the long run. If you compare that to the lease option, it's possible to include in the lease a minimum output criteria for the duration of the lease, which guarantees that the system works. Whereas in the power purchase agreement, the full technical risk of the asset working will be transferred to the private organization as they will be selling power per unit, and if the system doesn't work, they will not get paid. So if we go to the next slide, we'll look at some of the financial considerations connected to each of these options. So in the dark blue, we see the diesel generator. So what we have, the assumptions behind this slide is that I think we used Rumbek in South Sudan as a point of sort of where we got the data from, where diesel costs 1 liter and 40 cents, $1.40 per liter, and we took sort of a mid-sized compound into consideration. And what we see for the first year and for the diesel is that you have to procure the generators. That costs a bit, so you have a sort of a higher cost at the first year, and then you see a stable cost for year 2 and year 6, where mainly the costs are related to the diesel that you procure and the maintenance of the generators. The dark green bar represents the procurement of or the purchase of a solar system, where you see you have a very big cost in year 1, and then for year 2 and 6 that cost drops considerably, and the cost you remain with is the energy that you or the maintenance of the solar system and the remaining energy that you supply with your diesel generator. The yellow bar shows the lease option that will have quite a stable cost for the duration of the lease. I think we have included a 5-year sort of consideration or lease agreement in this example. So you see for year 6, the cost will drop considerably as the sort of the lease is over and the ownership of the asset is transferred to the organization. And finally, you have the light green option, which is the PPA. I've included both the limited and the full PPA in this course because they have quite a similar financial impact on the organization, where you see they will tend to have a very similar cost for the first 5 years. That will be the lowest of the 4 options in this case. But in year 5, when in the lease, you will have you will remain with quite a high cost sort of for the duration of the lifetime of the asset, because you will never own the asset, and you'll have to continue paying the solar company for the services that they provide. If you go to the next slide, it shows the accumulated costs of these four options. And I think this slide quite well shows the point that Laura was making earlier about the sort of accumulated long-term costs of running diesel generator is just very much higher than any solar options. So the dark green line shows the accumulated cost of diesel generator, which is it's quite a stable line. In year 7 to 9, you have a procurement of generators as they will need to be replaced, but it's quite stable and it's much higher than the solar options. The darker green shows the purchase option, where it starts out quite high, but you have very low costs over time, and over the 10 years will be the cheapest option. The yellow is the lease option, which will have you avoid the upfront costs, but over the 5 years you'll have paid back the system, and you see a kink in the line as you only pay for the maintenance of the system and the diesel costs after year 5. And then the light green is the solar PPA, which will be the cheapest option in the first 5 years. There's a slight kink at year 5, as organizations will have the ability to renegotiate very often the PPA costs as the solar companies have paid back the price of the asset. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, so I think Laura, you'll take this one.
Yeah, and just to briefly touch on, some of the challenges more widely with implementing some of these things, but also some of the opportunities. What we've seen is often the biggest barrier is not really technical. It's more relates to the institutional barriers within organizations themselves, because it can be challenging for organizations that are budgeted annually to enter long-term agreements. So that's something we've seen as a big challenge to uptake. Some other challenges can be around considering how to consolidate demand when you have different agencies or different buildings close to each other, but it can be more efficient if you could pool those resources together, but this can sometimes be challenging for agencies that again operate off different budgets and potentially report to different donors. Again, aligning incentives for agencies to transition. Obviously, it makes sense if whoever is making the investment in the solar system is realizing a cost benefit from that. But in certain cases, maybe agencies are given diesel in kind and maybe there's someone else that realizes the benefit. So there's a need to kind of align incentives for those people involved. And also what we've seen is operational roles can change within a humanitarian and displacement context. If you're, an agency might be managing a facility for so many years, but it might be change hands or, that role renegotiated. But at the same time, some of the opportunities that we've explored through MEI's research is potentially, working with donors on providing guarantees or providing funding for longer term agreements, working with procurement departments to make policies more compatible with engaging in these types of contracts. And again, working with the private sector can help overcome some of these barriers when they can take some, some of the responsibility for operating these assets, which can mean that, they can be providing services to multiple agencies at once. And again, there's a need to work with some of the lead agencies in these settings, such as UNHCR, local governments, and others, to make sure that incentives are being aligned and those agencies can take on a coordinating role to make sure everyone benefits from these types of agreements. Next slide. And then another topic I wanted to touch on is around, how we can use solar systems to also potentially extend connection and connectivity to local communities and businesses. And there's some challenges around this in terms of potentially uncertainty around the willingness or ability of displaced communities and businesses to pay for the power. It can result in a higher cost of connection when you're connecting lots of individual households and building that distribution network. You can also, depending on the country, come up with licensing requirements to sell power, because it's one thing if you're generating energy for your own consumption, but as soon as you want to start selling or distributing that power, there may be regulations that come into effect. And again, the billing and management of some of those connections. However, there are, again, opportunities and models that can be tested for this. And something that's commonly known as an ABC model with mini-grids is when you have a large anchor client that could be a humanitarian agency that can provide a substantial portion of the demand for a solar system, but then you then consider other connections, so businesses that might be using energy for productive use, and then smaller connections that could be several households that have smaller energy needs. But when you combine the different types of connections, it still provides a potentially cost-effective business model for the private sector. And then engaging the private sector, they could be potentially taking on also the licensing and regulation requirements and selling that power to both humanitarian agencies, but also businesses and communities. So these are some of the things that can be tested in these locations. Okay, next slide. And I'll hand back over to Mads.
Thanks. So what we have in the last part of the presentation, we just wanted to share some of the experiences that we've had from sort of spending a lot of time in the last years in the field. And what we wanted to share doesn't necessarily just relate to organizations wanting to transition to renewables, but I think there are some aspects that illustrate the sort of the shortcomings on electricity production in general. And one common thing that we have seen in among the humanitarian organizations is that the risk of technical failure is very high for renewable equipment. So the two main reasons that we see for this is poor design of the system, either with poor components, or as we see in the picture to the left, poor design choices. So this is a lead acid battery being stored in a metal box on the roof of a building in Mali, where it will get very hot, and for lead acid batteries like that, they will not even last a year in those conditions. Another reason why system fails is due to the lack of maintenance and cleaning. So we think that this illustrates the benefit of shifting responsibility of technical risks over to solar companies in sort of either the leased or the PPA structure, and that can be worth a little bit of extra cost. Another issue that we often see is that organizations tend to have massively oversized generators in their compounds. So this makes their operating costs unnecessarily high, but it also makes it very difficult to have meaningful energy saving measures, as any energy that you save will only impact on the efficiency of the generators. Also, in a system where you have oversized generators, installing solar panels in a fuel-saving system is also very difficult, because the electricity produced from the solar panels only lowers the efficiency of the generator even further. On the third issue that we have seen is that organizations tend to lack a certain coordination on energy. In the picture to the right, we see the humanitarian hub in Maban in South Sudan, where 11 organizations have adjacent compounds, and 11 organizations are running oversized generators. So in this case, there could be massive savings just from connecting the compounds to each other and sharing electricity. And for any renewable solutions, it would absolutely make much more sense to look at one central system providing power to these organizations rather than having 11 separate isolated ones. If you go to the next slide. So in the end, we just also wanted to have a call to action for the organizations or the participants here. where we want to provide some very tangible recommendations with more ambitious ones. So the first two recommendations is something we think every organization should do. And that is firstly to start measuring the electricity consumption in all your locations. We recommend that you use a logger like the one in the picture to the left. They are very cheap to buy, around maybe $100, and extremely easy to install. So most people that operate a generator can install them. We have seen some organizations that try to calculate their energy use using Excel sheets, and we very often find that first of all, it takes a very long time to do, and they're not very accurate. And many organizations actually tend to overestimate the amount of electricity that they consume. The second recommendation is to start really recording the expenses related to energy production. We're often surprised to see that organizations have no idea how much they actually spend. And we encourage organizations to not only include the fuel costs, but also the cost of the depreciation of the generator and the maintenance to get an actual picture of their long-term spending. So if you have both your electricity consumption and your expenses, I think it would be great if organizations started to compare the results of that between their operations, especially if you have global operations, to see if you have big outliers and maybe get in contact with those offices to ask them to do something about their installations. So I think these two first steps also, they're very crucial in creating a foundation where you can also approach renewable energy companies to hear about solar, as you will know what your load profile is, and you will know sort of what your saving will be. So the third recommendation is that we want to encourage all the participants here to try to find or work towards finding a solution for their office, and really I think that the business case for installing solar is very good, and we would encourage all the participants to check with their procurement office, with their country directors, and try to start the process of transitioning to solar. So I think for the final slide we have, it's on some useful resources. So we have produced a handbook with many of the slides included in this presentation. We have also produced a video with some footage from Kakuma that can be useful. I don't know, Laura, if you want to talk about some of the resources that MEI has produced.
Yeah, so and you can follow the links in these slides after, but you'll see on the MEI website, you'll find the report into humanitarian, the energy use of humanitarian agencies, and also one on infrastructure management contracts that again looks at some of these issues. As Mad said, the handbook contains a lot of information about the different options and economic analysis that we did in this presentation. So I'd recommend people to look at that as well. There's lots of resources out there on kind of solar and PV systems, and we've listed one here that can give an introduction for people that want more technical background on it. And then the final 2 points are two other organizations and initiatives that are working on this topic that we would encourage organizations to get involved in, to get involved with and reach out to. So the first is the Global Plan of Action, that's trying to provide a kind of coordinated framework to address humanitarian energy issues. And lastly is the Safe Working Group, which tries to provide kind of training and resources for people looking at fuel and energy access and displacement settings. And just to also mention, there's actually going to be a SAFE workshop at a humanitarian energy conference held in Addis Ababa later in July this year. I'm not sure if it's still open for registration, but again, it's something that people can look at that might be wanting to get more involved in this topic or find out more information. And last slide. Yeah, just to provide you with some context for follow-up, and just to mention, today is actually my last day before going on maternity leave, so this was my last task to accomplish. So I've also provided some additional contacts here. My colleague Owen Graham at Chatham House, who led the research into the humanitarian energy use, and we have Mad's contacts here as well at Cube Energy. But yeah, I think that's it from us.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. This is a wealth of information. And as people have seen, we've been posting a lot of these links in the chat window also, so you can click through on that. And obviously, all of this will be available in the follow-up email where we're going to send out the links to these slides and the recording. I think we're going to turn it over to Duncan. He is going to do some of the Q&A facilitation. So, Duncan, over to you.
Thanks, Frederick, and thank you so much, Laura, Mads, for that presentation. So yeah, we had quite a few questions come in, so I'm going to try and ask those in a sort of summary way. So the first one, is the 570 million cost savings just for humanitarian agencies specifically engaged in displacement, or is that the whole international development sector?
I'm probably going to have to, I'm not sure I could answer that on the spot. I'd probably have to refer it to my colleagues at Chatham House that did the research, but something I can follow up with and answer later, perhaps.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
For Mads, do you see solar or renewable energy as standalone solutions, or do you typically see a hybrid solution where generators are still part of the mix?
I think for the systems that we've seen, very often the cost of trying to run an office or a compound only by solar is much, much higher than if you allow for example, solar to generate 90% of the energy. It's just you need to build up very expensive battery banks in case you encounter days with clouds and where the panels will not generate a lot. So very often we see that it doesn't make economic sense to try to go 100% solar unless the location of the compounds are in quite extreme areas where it's very difficult to get the fuel in and where the logistics of that is difficult.
Right. Do you see a point when the cost of batteries falls below a certain level and it becomes viable, or how far do you think we might be away from that?
Well, we were hoping that the cost of batteries would fall faster. For the battery banks that we're looking at in 2018, the cost actually increased a little bit. So it's a bit hard to predict, but I think it's going to be at least 4 or 5 years until the batteries are so cheap that it will make sense for most organizations to go fully solar.
And those cost charts that you showed were the lines for PPA or ownership of solar. Did they include having generators providing some of the energy?
So those the financial charts, I should probably have mentioned this during the presentation, but we took a sort of a solar controlled system as a point of departure, where the solar would provide around 80% of the energy in those cases.
Okay, great. And how, to what extent will cooperation with local governments be critical to a successful transition to these energy solutions? I think that one's really for Laura.
Yeah, I think it can be important. You know, it depends on the context. Often, you know, local governments are quite involved in providing assistance in humanitarian settings. So I think it can be important. One, if you're considering potentially having solar systems as a legacy asset, or you want to also be providing power to local communities and extending to communities. also if in terms of licensing and things for selling power, there'll need to be involvement from the local communities. And I think it's very important in all of these solutions to be thinking quite holistically about these displacement settings of the displaced people themselves, but also the communities around and the government. So there can also be potentially a lot of benefits for local governments to work with humanitarian agencies in the private sector to implement these solutions, because they can benefit everyone in these areas.
If I can just jump in on that as well. I think for our experience is that it depends a little bit on also the context and sort of your relationship with the local government. What we've seen in South Sudan is that it's not been very easy to work with the local government, and so we tend to focus on solutions that are only for the humanitarian organizations themselves. Whereas in Somalia and Mali, we have a much closer relationship with the local government, where we have installed assets not inside the compounds of the humanitarian organizations, but outside, and use the humanitarian organizations as sort of a bankable anchor client, but where we also provide some of the power to the local communities, and where we will transition the ownership of the asset not to the humanitarian organization, but to the local government themselves. So it depends a little bit on the working relationship you have with them.
Hey, Duncan, this is Frederick. While you're finishing up the Q&A, I'm going to start the poll that we talked about at the beginning of the session about the topics that people want to have covered. So for the next 3 minutes, you get a chance to answer those questions as well. So Duncan, back to you.
Oh yes, please everybody do take a look at the poll questions that have just appeared to indicate which areas you'd like to see future webinars on. I think that's a really interesting point that you raised there, and just kind of interested in whether the relationships that you had with governments that enabled it to be a sort of public resource in Somalia and Mali, whether that was because of your relationship with the government or Cube Energy's relationship with the governments, or the sort of the anchor tenants.
It was largely dependent on the anchor tenants, and both in Somalia and in Mali, the anchor tenants were felt quite secure physically in the locations, and so it was also easier for us to install an asset and feeling confident that it wouldn't be stolen or looted if insecurity would increase. So we had very little engagement with the local government before these projects, but using those relationships that the organizations had, we were able to work with them to make these assets public.
Brilliant. Okay, one last question. Are there all-in-one energy monitoring and management tools available that can help organizations better manage their energy usage?
I would say there are a number of monitors that you can use to look at sort of the overall consumption of electricity at compounds. I can make sort of a few of the ones that we have experience working with available after the webinar. I think that they're sort of, you find them in all price ranges. We tend to use quite a few of the cheaper ones, and they're sort of are maybe 97 to 98% accurate. So they're quite, and that's sufficient for us. We also encourage organizations to go sort of at to divide the compounds into smaller units as well. And we had one organization in South Sudan where sort of the office installed energy monitors on the various ACs, and they had a little internal sort of competition on between sort of who could be more energy efficient. And you can find a lot of these quite cheap smart plugs available online that work quite well.
Okay, fantastic. Actually, there are a couple of short questions, I think, or hopefully the answers are short. Why would PPA costs decrease with time? I
think that once the asset or the solar companies have paid back the asset, and the asset is installed, so it's sort of a sunk cost for them, and it will cost them quite a lot to move the asset, which means that the organizations have quite a bit of leverage in renegotiating PPA contracts. So let's say you have an initial contract for 5 years, the asset is still there, it's working, and the organization wants to extend, then you will be in a good position to tell the solar company, you have paid back your asset, and let's now share the benefit of this asset continuing to produce power. And that's why I think you're in a good position to negotiate down the cost of the PPA.
Brilliant. And then the last one, do you use local workers when you're doing installations? And if so, how do you train them so that they are capable of maintaining the systems?
So I think that there's sort of much of the maintenance is cleaning panels, which is not complicated at all. So that doesn't require much training more than showing people how to use squidgies and things like that. So that's not very complicated, and most sort of unskilled labor can do that. For the technical maintenance, that's much more complicated, and it's the systems that we install are remotely monitored, so that there's a monitoring team that will have surveillance over the performance of the system 24/7, and you would need a very highly skilled technician to maintain them. So the first thing they will do is plug a computer into the system when they arrive. So we have not been able to use local labor for those functions.
Okay. Well, look, thank you so much for your time today. Certainly learned lots of different things, and see a few different ways forward for the sector. Thanks everybody for filling out your polls. You probably see the results there just now to see mini grids, very popular area for future topics. So,
yes, Duncan, that there's interest in all those different topics. So please look for additional webinars on everything going forward. Duncan, I also want to thank you for doing the Q&A facilitation. Laura Mutz for fantastic content and thoughtful solutions. Frank, thank you very much for you producing this series and staying on top of these challenges for our members. We are over time, I apologize for that, but we'll want to wish everybody a great rest of your day. Please take a minute or so to answer the webinar satisfaction poll that'll pop up on your screen when you leave the webinar. And we hope to see you again soon in upcoming webinars on this topic. Thanks, everyone. Take care.